Hi, welcome to the third KV518 podcast of this year. It's New Year's Eve, so I hope you've had a good festive period, and this is being posted a week ahead of our next Reflective Practice Saturday on the 9th of January. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes or so about the kind of theme for this week, as well as say a little bit about the structure of the Saturday session coming up soon. So a year ago, you may remember, we had one of the podcasts I did looked at the ideas of equality, diversity and inclusion. And within that, we talked about how those terms become interpreted in different ways. And so where we're talking about equality, diversity and inclusion, we need to be very clear about what we actually mean, but also what some of the ideas behind those concepts are. And if you like, they are sometimes referred to as contested concepts. By that, I mean they're open to interpretation. So we have to be also always very careful about when we're talking about inclusion or equality or diversity, that we're clear about what we mean and that we're open to questioning about what those terms represent in terms of underpinning philosophies. So we're going to kind of build on that a bit more today. I'm going to introduce a couple of key terms, one being something called discourse analysis. We're going to look at how policy, both government policy and organisational policy, are relevant to us and how we need to be clear about the basis of that policy and also question it, and question it in terms of its implications for professional practice. And I'm going to end by focusing on two areas that I think are quite interesting areas for us going into 2016. The notion of fairness and what fairness means in terms of children and young people's lives, and also the notion of character education and what character education might mean and might embody and what implications that might have for us. When we are thinking about the way that governments develop work with children and young people, we need to be aware that the practice in our schools, in our nurseries, in our youth provision doesn't come out of thin air. In a sense, it's created within a policy context. And that policy context usually starts from either a national governmental position, so the government might have key policies, key strategies around particular issues, and alongside that are the organisation we work for, the school, the nursery, the setting, the youth project, whatever it might be, the college, will have its own policies, and sometimes those policies will directly reflect government policy, particularly if that government policy is a legal framework, or it might be a policy that's specific to that organisation. And sometimes organisations develop their own policies which reflect the ethos and the values of that organisation. And if we think back historically, when the Labour government came in 1997, with Tony Blair as the new Prime Minister at that point, the big idea that, if you like, that the government had at the time was this notion of drawing our attention to the way that society excluded certain groups of people, and so created a framework that was referred to as the social inclusion framework. And a lot of the early policy in the Labour government was based on that social inclusion policy. And that resulted in a whole number of different developments in the children and young people's services coming out of the Labour government, particularly on the back of Every Child Matters, particularly kind of framed a lot of the practices within the social inclusion agenda. We had a change of government in 2010, and prior to that, one of Cameron's big ideas before he was elected as Prime Minister was this notion of how, from his perspective, society was, and he used the phrase, society was broken. And he drew attention to what he felt were a number of issues within society and that affected children and young people's learning and development and health and social care and so on. And he referred to the society as being broken in some way and therefore it needed fixing. And for him at the time, the one of the solutions was offered in the idea of a big society. And if you remember, this is going back to 2010, the notion of a big society would be that society itself would start to seek solutions to the problems rather than the state providing the solutions. And in fact, many of the services that previously the society had provided, the state had provided, would now be taken up by community groups and the voluntary sector. And the notion was that this would then alleviate the burden of spending on local authorities, on public services, and alongside the kind of notion of a big society, Cameron used that phrase, we're all in it together, as a way of justifying cuts to public services under the so-called austerity measures. And so we created a framework then where public funding went down, funding on public services went down, the notion that we together would somehow create a fabric which would respond to society, and this notion of the big society will be the answer. Now, in fact, over the course of the last government, the Liberal Democrat Conservative government, the notion of the big society was dropped, and in fact the move towards community and voluntary service sector taking over the funding of what was previously state-funded services didn't happen, and in fact services across the board were cut. And going into the more recent election, Cameron replaced the notion of big society with the idea of one nation, and one nation was seen as the kind of the new idea that we, by describing it as one nation, we then somehow became a society was joined together and was seen to be addressing the problems together. And this, in a sense, echoed his previous point about we're all in it together. Now, clearly, I would suggest it's a contested issue whether we are all in it together and whether the burden of austerity cuts have been borne across the society in a fair way. And that introduces me to this notion of fairness. Now, fairness is a concept which certainly the children we work with will be only too familiar. That's not fair if somebody does something that is perceived in somehow to favour one group or one individual. And generally, if we're thinking about, I hate to say this phrase, but what we might see as British values, the notion of fairness will probably be kind of on there most people's lists. We pride ourselves of, in some senses, living in a society that's fair. Now, the Equalities in Human Rights Commission recently published a report called How Fair is Britain, which says, and this was in October 2015, so only a couple of months ago, and that report identifies where within our different aspects of society, including education and children and young people's development, where we have addressed issues of fairness and where, in a sense, we have created a more equal society or more fair society, but also where society is still far from fair, far from equal and far from balanced. So I would encourage you to have a look at that report, How Fair is Britain. I'll post a link to it on the Student Central site. And the issues particularly that it highlights in relation to education, achievement, young people's development and so on. Now, the other concept I want to kind of highlight here, it relates to a government policy that was introduced by Nicky Morgan at the very end of 2014, going into 2015, and has since started to gain some movement over the last year. And it's the notion of character education. And if you like, the way that within our services for children and young people, we need to embody ways of working with children and with young people that support this notion of character building. And I think it's quite an interesting idea. In some respects, it echoes what many of us have been involved in for a long time now in relation to PSHE, citizenship, and those type of issues. but it perhaps goes a little bit further, and in particular it draws on models that were developed, I think, in the USA, and again I'll post some links to that on the Student Central site. But this notion that education, and by education I'm referring to the whole range of services that are reflected on our courses here, so right from early years through to FE. This notion that our role as educators, as people responsible and involved with children and young people's development, our role is some way should be contributing to developing character. And I would like to suggest that I think the concept of character, again, is a contested term. And by that I mean I think it's open to interpretation. So, for example, would not expressing your feelings be seen as being of a strong character? Certainly, when I grew up, the notion that, particularly for men, you should have a stiff upper lip and you shouldn't show your feelings, was part of what was perceived to be having a strong character. And I would imagine there are similar things we might ascribe to what might have been seen as feminine characters. So the notion of character, I think, is open to question. I think it's open to question in terms of gender. Is a character that we might expect from women the same as we might expect from men? And it's also culturally dependent as well. So we would need to be careful about assuming that there is a kind of a blueprint for character for our children, young people growing up, that we then are aiming to kind of support in our nurseries, in our schools, in our youth projects, in our colleges. So I think the idea of character building as a key element of our provision is one that's worth looking at and worth questioning and thinking about what are the implications for us in terms of our practice. So two ideas that I'm kind of suggesting that we need to examine: this notion of fairness and how we see fairness. What does it mean in terms of our work? What does it mean for us in terms of our approaches to equality and inclusion? And also the notion of character building and how we see character building as part of our professional responsibility, and in fact what we mean by character, and therefore what the implications are for our practice. And to return then to the beginning of this podcast, I introduced this phrase discourse analysis. And so discourse analysis is a way of seeing government policy which says our professional responsibility is when policy is produced by either the government or the organisations for whom we work, then our professional responsibility is to really explore what's being said in that policy. What's being said and what's behind what's being said. Is the policy based on research? Is the policy based on kind of a theoretical and robust understanding of the issue? Is the policy based on an analysis which is a robust analysis of the situation? Are the problems that are perceived real problems, and are the solutions to those problems robust solutions? So this isn't I'm not just kind of in a sense knocking government policy, but I'm saying is it's our role, whatever the government is, or whoever we work for, that we explore, we interrogate, if you like, we try and read between the lines implicitly what's being said in that policy. And that process of understanding and questioning and critiquing policy is what I refer to as discourse analysis. We're unpicking and questioning the discourse, the messages behind the policy. So, we've got our next Saturday coming up on the 9th of January. Both Year 2 group will be in looking at KV518, but also Year 1s will be in on KV421, the module you did this time last year. And unusually on these Saturdays, we're going to bring the two groups together. So the part of the timetable on the Saturday will include both Year 1 and Year 2 groups coming together to explore issues across the year groups. So I'll put out a timetable for all of Year 1 and Year 2 for KV421 and KV518 onto Student Central this weekend. We've finalised the room, so I can let you have all that information. Finally, have a think about what advice you would give to the Year 1 group, this time. They're halfway through their first year, so remember back to what it was like for you this time last year. They're just coming to the end of their first learning contract, so this will be the third of the Saturdays where they're in those reflective practice groups. They're going to be setting their second learning contract of the year, as will you. And they'll be kind of coming to the end of their second full module and shortly to move into their third module of the year. So have a think about what advice you'll be giving to them about where they're up to in their first year. And also think about your own development over this second year. And of course, you've got one second half of this second year before you start to prepare for your third year. So it's kind of a halfway reflection point in the year. I hope you have a good new year, and I look forward to working with you during 2016, and I look forward to seeing you again on Saturday the 9th of January. Thanks a lot.